So you might have seen the news recently, and by recently I mean yesterday, that Formula 1 will stop the whole taking a knee we racers one thing before each race, because apparently they've got other stuff they want to do with that, which prompted a lot of people on Facebook who have been to the School of Hard Knocks or the University of Life, yes, those educational institutions that are a lot better than Oxford and Cambridge, to all say the same thing. Good. Sports and politics shouldn't mix. Yeah, about that. The thing is, politics and sport, even in Formula 1, have always gone hand in hand. In the first ever World Championship race, there was politics because of the starting money that was handed out. Basically, what would happen is the organisers of each race would pay the teams to race, rather than the teams paying to race, as you pretty much get these days, and the starting money was divvied out based on the pulling power of drivers and teams. A bit like how it works, or at least used to work, in professional wrestling, and I experienced it myself when I was doing the bar and club circuit in East Anglia about, 10 years ago? Is it really 10 years ago? Jesus Christ. So in the early 1960s, for instance, Jim Clark and Lotus would have probably got more than Vanwell, for instance. Long story short, and I'm assuming here, is that at the first ever World Championship race, the teams got equal pay, or at least close to equal pay, until Enzo Ferrari realised he wasn't getting paid more than everybody else, and then immediately withdrew his cars from the race at Silverstone. That's politics. But if we're talking politics, then you've got to look no further than the 1985 South African Grand Prix. And this whole politics and sport trying to change things isn't something that was kicked off by Colin Kaepernick, Lewis Hamilton, or the Premier League. Now, in history at school, you might have looked at Rosa Parks on the bus, or Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, and all that stuff that happened over in the United States. But in South Africa, they had their own system that was probably a lot worse. Apartheid. What this meant is that South Africa was dominated socially, politically and economically by the white population, and South Africa passed laws that prohibited black and white citizens marrying, having relationships, just in general being friends, falling in love, all the stuff that we do, even I've done. I know that's hard to believe. I find it hard to believe that I'm actually married as well, but the point remains. You weren't allowed to mix racially, which means that the South African comedian and host of The Daily Show, Trevor Noah, was, for the first 5 or 6 years of his life, born a crime, which is the title of his book, come to think of it. Under South African law, he shouldn't have existed. Imagine being here on Earth and technically not being allowed to exist, having your entire existence be illegal. And this is the thing that we were dealing with here. And this was, just over 35 years ago, so some of your lifetimes. Now, Formula 1 had already raced at South Africa several times already with these laws in place. They'd raced pre- and post-war at the East London circuit up until 1966, and then moved to the state-of-the-art Kyalami circuit for 1967, when the South African Grand Prix was held before it got shelved after 1985. By sort of 1980, the United Nations was keeping tabs on sports people that had just entered South Africa. They didn't even need to compete, they just had to enter South Africa with something called the Register of Sports Contact with South Africa list thing. And Formula 1 drivers were possibly on this list, given that they were racing in South Africa, but there were footballers, cricketers, golfists, tennis players, all of that stuff on this list. By 1985, the situation in South Africa had become pretty bad. Towns inhabited by black South Africans were refusing to pay rent on their homes, and making their towns become ungovernable by refusing to comply with the white-dominated government, and then violence escalated. The government subjected about 40,000 people a year to beatings for daring to rise up against the government. By the July of 1985, the government had initiated a state of emergency across 36 districts in South Africa, and 2,500 people were immediately detained because of something called the Internal Security Act, which gave the president of South Africa at the time, a guy called P.W. Botha, free rein to basically do whatever he wanted. People could just be detained for no reason. People could be banged up in prison for 10 years for no reason. There was things like false imprisonment, censored media, torture, the works. So then moving on into the October of 1985, it was time for the South African Grand Prix to come round as the 15th round of a 16-round season. And because of the civil unrest going on in South Africa at that time that had kicked off in the summer, as we've already mentioned, the drivers were being pressured into doing something. Not just by the United Nations and things like that, but their actual governments were pressuring them to do something. The drivers were put into difficult positions. Alain Prost, Niki Lauda and Nigel Mansell all spoke out publicly about their discomfort around racing in a place where torture, beatings, censorship and so on were now as common as going to the shops for a pint of milk. But because they felt obligated to their contracts, they decided to race anyway, while making their discomfort clear. A bit like what Lewis Hamilton did in Saudi Arabia a few months ago. Meanwhile, the French government was sanctioning South Africa pretty heavily, and because of his relationship with the people in Paris and because he had a lot of friends in high places, Guy Ligier withdrew his cars from the race, and because Renault was owned in majority by the French government, they pulled out of the race as well. Other governments tried to pile on the pressure as well. The Swedish government tried to order Stefan Johansson not to go to South Africa, but he went anyway because of contractual obligations. The same can be said for Keke Rosberg as well. He was pressured by the Finnish government to not go to South Africa, but he went and raced anyway too. Ayrton Senna and Nelson Piquet were almost barred by the Brazilian government from going, but they eventually turned up, with Senna stating he would only race if Lotus decided that Lotus was going to be racing. Senna later said he wouldn't race, but then reverted on his decision anyway. The sponsors were also kicking off. Marlboro ordered every single logo removed from every single car that their logo was present on, and Beatrice Food, who had a stake in the Haas Lola team at that time, which is a different Haas to what's on the grid today, also ordered removal of logos. Now, Alan Jones, the 1980 world champion, qualified his car in 18th place for the South African Grand Prix in 1985, but didn't show up for the race. Beatrice Foods, like Marlboro, was a US-based company specialising in food processing, but Beatrice was operating in South Africa at the time, using something called divestment to operate without affecting business interests in South Africa. Yeah, I don't know either, I know nothing about the markets. But both Marlboro and Beatrice were under significant pressure from noted activists such as Jesse Jackson to pull out of Formula One entirely, at least in South Africa, and there were African American workers at Marlboro and Beatrice threatening industrial action if their logos were seen in South Africa, if you can see where I'm coming from. So where did Jones run off to? He pulled a sickie. Under Bernie's instructions, apparently. Now, it's not confirmed, but it's either one of two things. AJ wasn't comfortable with racing and needed a way out, or he was offering Haas an excuse to get out and save face with the team and with Beatrice Foods. So on the morning of the race, Bernie supposedly went up to Carl Haas and asked where Jones was, and Haas just went, yeah, Bernie, sorry man, it looks like that AJ's got a stomach bug, he might have had something dodgy last night, like, he's trapped in his hotel room, he's really sick, he can't make the race, like, really sorry man, really, really sorry. And Bernie just went, oh no! Anyway, but if you look at the official results from the race, AJ is down as it did not start because unwell. Williams finished the race 1-2, Mansell coming home ahead of Rosberg at the final South African Grand Prix for a fair few years, and it was also the final South African Grand Prix held on that layout of Kyalami. Even without apartheid, the days of that track were numbered. Because the cars were getting faster and faster and faster, the FIA believed that within a few years, times at that track would be sub 1 minute. Qualifying time for that race was around the 1 minute 2 mark, so kind of what you're seeing at somewhere like, I don't know, the A1 ring. Not called the A1 ring anymore, is it? What's called the Red Bull ring? That's what it's called. But, you know, it wasn't going to wash with them. But Jean-Marie Balestri, the president of the FIA at the time, said that until South Africa got its stuff together, there would be no more South African Grand Prix. They revisited the track again in 1992 and 1993 on a revised layout of the circuit, which is looking to come back into Formula One within the next few years, provided that they can strike a deal with the new owners of Formula One, as well as get the circuit up to scratch. But it wasn't just workers in companies that sponsored F1 teams that were kicking off. In 1985, there was a protest at Howard University in Washington when Paul Simon defied a UN boycott of South Africa to travel to South Africa and record an album. The students accused Simon of being the typical white musician stealing black music, like it happened with blues and jazz, but what the album did was reveal the rhythms, sounds and languages of native African music and showed the world what was being muzzled, I guess is the word. The sounds of South Africa were being revealed to the world. It generated sympathy for the people there, and the whole album wasn't one big political diatribe against the horrors of the South African government. It was just music, and it gave people hope for change. As one journalist at the LA Times put it, "It's when I listen to the spirited words and music of Simon and Ladysmith Black Mambazo that the future seems the clearest, that oppressors can never trample the human spirit, and that the natives in South Africa ultimately will win." It's one of my favourite albums of all time, and it's by far Paul Simon's greatest album of his very, very long career. And when you're done with this video, I urge you to go and listen to the song Diamonds on the Soles of Her Shoes. It's got all those African rhythms in, it's got an a cappella African choir going on. It's absolutely fantastic. I know it's not F1 related or motorsport related, but it's extra to what was going on in Africa at that time and how everything got resolved in the end. About 5 years later, after the 1985 South African Grand Prix and also Graceland coming out, apartheid ended, thanks to sport helping to pile on the pressure. But anyway, that's a look at the time that sports and politics combined, and not for the first time. If you've enjoyed this look through the motorsport history books, then click the like button. If you want to see more like this, then obviously get subscribed and get the bell on if you haven't already, so you never miss out on a future video from this channel. Massive thanks as ever go out to the patrons of this channel via Patreon. If you want to help support me at a more personal level, you can do so by following the link in the description that will be there to Patreon, as well as links to Discord and also to my socials. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. So until next time, goodbye.